All right, all right. Glad you all that are here are here. You obviously are the ones that don't have the flu, which is great yet. So, great announcement from Evan. You guys can eat pie and love people at the same time. So, there's nothing wrong with that. Well, we are in Judges chapter 19 today. We are actually going to be finishing up the book of Judges. We have a lot to try to cover today, and we're actually going to try to do something a little bit different. Brad had this idea that the two of us should tag team teach. So we're going like WWF, where I will tap out midway, and then we are also going to be doing something else kind of new for us, and that is we're going to be passing the mic around. We're not going to keep you here forever. 2 to 3 people that just want to share something that the Lord has shown them in the book of Judges, taught them in our time here, or maybe just a story of something that God has done in your life kind of throughout the last few months as we have covered this incredibly horrific book. So we want to invite you kind of into that conversation. So if you think about it, and that's something you want to do, we'll be passing that mic here in a little bit. So welcome to New Things at TFAB today. Well, as you guys know, Judges 19, today, as Evan happily said, it is the start of Advent, which means you are now allowed to listen to Christmas music. So that's, some of you actually need somebody with outside authority to tell you that, because some of you have been jump-starting that since like September when you got your pumpkin spice latte, okay? So just know you're welcome. There are proper seasons, and this is absolutely the proper season. But Advent is the celebration of the coming of our Savior, Jesus Christ. And now we are finishing up the book of Judges, which means if you came expecting a Christmas story, you might be a little bit disappointed here today. Because what we do here at TFAB is we just go through books of the Bible. This just happens to be where we land. But this story, I'm going to tell you, it comes with a mature label here this morning. This is not really a Christmas story. It feels a lot more like something that Hannibal Lecter might do or be a part of. And I will say this, it is because of stories like this, with people doing what is right in their own eyes, that Christmas is actually necessary. It's because of the gruesomeness of the book of Judges, and really humanity in general, that we needed a Savior to come. Now, at this point in Israel's history, they have forgotten and rejected the Lord as their king. We have seen this over and over, and it didn't take them very long. A generation is all it took. And everyone, the Bible continues to tell us in Judges, is simply doing what is right in their own eyes, which means it's the opposite of what God would view and how God would see them. What is right in the eyes of the sinner is actually wrong. And left to ourselves, as we read through many of these stories, you just see Israel in a state of kind of self-destruct. Now, thanks to Christmas, though, we have not been left to ourselves. So today's story, like the Christmas story, though, it is going to actually begin in the little town of Bethlehem. Chapter 19, starting in verse 1. In those days, when there was no king in Israel, a certain Levite was sojourning in the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim, and he took to himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. And his concubine was unfaithful to him, and she went away from him to her father's house at Bethlehem in Judah, and was there for some 4 months. Then her husband arose and went after her to speak kindly to her and bring her back. And he had with him his servant and a couple of donkeys, and she brought him into her father's house. When the girl's father saw him, he came with joy to meet him. And his father-in-law, the girl's father, made him stay, and he remained with him 3 days. So they ate and drank and spent the night there. And on the 4th day, they arose early in the morning, prepared to go. But the girl's father said to his son-in-law, "Strengthen your heart with a morsel of bread, and after that you may go." So the two of them sat and ate, and they did more than just eat bread. They drank together. And the girl's father said to the man, Be pleased to spend the night, and let your heart be merry." And when the man rose up to go, his father-in-law pressed him till he spent the night there again. And on the 5th day he arose early in the morning to depart, and the girl's father said, "Strengthen your heart and wait until the day declines." So they ate, both of them. When the man and his concubine and his servant rose up to depart, his father-in-law, the girl's father, said to him, "Behold, now the day has waned towards evening. Please spend the night. Behold, the day draws to close. Lodge here, and let your heart be merry. And tomorrow you shall arise early in the morning for your journey to go home." But the man would not spend the night. He rose up and he departed, and he arrived opposite Jebus, that is Jerusalem. He had with him a couple of saddled donkeys, and his concubine was with him. All right. Text starts off with, in those days, Israel had no king. Now, this is a very subtle warning that what is about to happen in this text has nothing to do with God and everything to do with a really bunch of bad dudes and a bunch of really bad decisions. Now, we are invited to meet another Levite. We met a Levite last week. We are invited now to meet another Levite. He's different from the Levite in chapter 17 and 18. Last week, we saw a false teacher Levite who operated more like a hiring, willing to kind of whore himself out to the highest bidder and telling people basically whatever they wanted to hear. He would just sell out what he did as a Levite or as a priest to simply get what he wanted. And he found the people that he would be able to speak it to because they wanted the same thing that he wanted. Now, this Levite in our chapter today isn't as concerned about religious propaganda, but he's concerned more really about his sex life. That's what he's concerned about. We are told he has a concubine. Now, this is virtually in that culture, it's like a second-class wife. She exists kind of for one purpose, and that was to serve him sexually. It's kind of like a priest. If a priest was hanging out with Epstein or going on a plane ride with him to one of his private islands. That's kind of the picture that you have here is a Levite priest basically purchasing for himself a female to take care of whatever pleasures he needs. Now, this is not a good priest. He is not a moral man. He's maybe 2 generations removed from Moses, and Aaron were his relatives. They were the ones that were originally given the law. And this man, you can just tell through the text, he has no respect for God or for his law. The Bible reveals what God's intention early on was for marriage, where it talks about in the very beginning in Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. We talked a little bit about this last week, but basically it was one man, one woman, one lifetime. That's the simplest understanding of like how God looks at and views marriage. However, many believers decided to look to culture in that day instead of God's word to define what marriage actually is. The culture often had multiple wives. The culture often also had multiple concubines. And as we've seen throughout the book of Judges, we've seen this Canaanization of Israel, and we have here virtually that happening before our very eyes. Who was supposed to be a religious man, someone that should have known the law, is simply now following suit with what the rest of culture did. Everyone was doing it, why wouldn't they? After all, it seemed right in their own eyes. So, that's what they did. So from Abraham even to Solomon, we see this thing of polygamy kind of taking place, which was having multiple wives. We see this idea of concubines kind of on the side. It was quite common. Abraham had a few. Now, it doesn't mean, and I think this is really important that we understand this, it doesn't mean that God simply condoned it because it's in the Bible. Just because something is in the Bible doesn't mean that God is strictly for it, right? It doesn't mean that it's right. It might just mean that God is just showing you what history was. It's no different than like the nightly news, which reports on various issues that might be going on. That doesn't mean that the news station condones what's actually happening in the culture. They're simply reporting it. And often the Bible reports some crazy things that crazy people do, and we're going to see one of the craziest stories here today. So here we have a Levite who was supposed to be set apart as holy to serve God, and instead he's choosing to serve himself. He has a concubine, which through his eyes, as we're going to see in this text, even in the father-in-law's eyes, she is not much more than simple property for him. That's how he views her. Now, look, their relationship, as you can imagine, it's not great. Like, it didn't start off well. The Bible says she plays the harlot virtually there in chapter 19, verse 2. He used her for sex. She used sex for money. The idea there was she was literally going out and selling herself out. Well, this goes bad between them. She leaves him. She returns to her father's house, which is in Bethlehem. Now, this Levite, who is an absolute tool in this text, and that's going to be more evident soon, but instead of pursuing her, instead of desiring reconciliation right away with her immediately, this guy waits 4 months before he goes to try to find out where she was at her father's house. Now, some people in Western culture might think, well, maybe he's just giving her a little bit of space. That's a very Western cultural mindset. The truth is, he's finally decided to go get her because he either wants the status of the fact that he had a concubine, or he is just missing out on the intimacy that he had with this particular woman. Now, Dad, who likely was embarrassed, perhaps even ashamed of his daughter's return, gladly welcomes this guy in. He shows him incredible hospitality, which we're not going to see that at the end of this text. He gets incredible hospitality for 5 days. Incredible amount of grace. Now, why is Dad being so nice? Hospitality like this was supposed to be normal in the culture. Perhaps he's going a little over the top because he knew both the penalties for both adultery and leaving an owner would have been severe, perhaps even death. Okay? And surely it would have been a disgrace for this man and for his family. So the father is hoping he will simply take her back and not put her down. Okay? Interestingly, there is nothing here that shows she wants to be with him. Nothing. There's no desire for her to return. It's simply integration between the Levite and her dad. He is simply trying to do an exchange back for this woman. Every indication is that the father gave her back to the Levite without her having a choice or even being able to make her own decision in this matter. Both the father and the Levite treat this woman as simply an object. One wants to avoid shame, the other wants to secure sexual favors. Neither care about the woman herself. Now, it's worth noting that unlike every other section in Judges, none of the characters are named. None of them. Which suggests that these men and women stand for literally everyone and everything that was kind of happening in Israel at the time. So in other words, this is how Levites lived. This is how fathers thought. This is how women were treated. Generically throughout Israel. When there was no king and people did what was right in their own eyes. Well, what happens next? Pick up in the story. When they were near Jebus, the day was nearly over, verse 11. And the servant said to his master, "Come now, let us turn aside to the city of the Jebusites and spend the night in it." And the master said to him, "We will not turn aside into the city of foreigners, who did not belong to the people of Israel, but we will pass on to Gibeah." And he said to his young man, "Come and let us draw near to one of these places and spend the night at Gibeah or at Ramah." So they passed on and went their way, and the sun went down on them near Gibeah, which belongs to Benjamin. And they turned aside there to go in and spend the night at Gibeah. And he went in and sat down in the open square of the city, for no one took them into his house to spend the night. And behold, an old man was coming from his work in the field at the evening. The man was from the hill country of Ephraim, and he was sojourning in Gibeah. And the men of the place were Benjaminites. And he lifted up his eyes and saw the traveler in the open square of the city. And the old men said, "Where are you going? Where do you come from?" And he said to him, we are passing from Bethlehem in Judah to remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim, from which I come. I went to Bethlehem in Judah, and I am going to the house of the Lord, but no one has taken me into his house. We have straw and feed for our donkeys, with bread and wine for me and your female servant, and the young man with your servants. There is no lack of anything. And the old man said, peace be to you. I will care for all your wants. Only do not spend the night in the square. So he brought him into his house and gave the donkeys feed. And they washed their feet and ate and they drank. After 5 days, this Levite and his concubine, they take off from their father-in-law's house. They come to the area of Jerusalem, a town which should have been Benjaminite, but because of their failure to obey God fully, it remained Canaanite. Remember, they were supposed to take the land. Because the day is almost over as they reach Jebus, the Levite servant says, you know what, it's late. We should probably just camp out right here. But the Levite is unwilling to go into a foreign city who wasn't maintained by the people of Israel. And the idea here is pretty plain. It is not safe for Israel to be around the Canaanites. It's not safe. It's not civilized. They could be a violent people. They could try to take advantage of us, which is about to make what happens even worse. So he decides to try to reach Gibeah, which he thinks would be a safer place. They arrive at night. We see that there is a problem. No one is willing to welcome them in. See, in those days, you didn't have Holiday Inn, right? You didn't just have like the bed and breakfast spots that you could just stop off at. The people of the town were supposed to be willing to take in foreigners that would come through. In other words, every house should have been an Airbnb. Basically, when you came into town, if you knocked on a door, you needed a place to stay, you should have been able to be given a place to stay. Well, an Ephraimite, not a Benjaminite, comes strolling through town. And this man invites them into his house, and he begins to hint at something, that there is something not right that's taking place in this town. He says, whatever you do, do not spend the night out here in this square. What's going on? This isn't a Canaanite town. This should be safe. What's so dangerous about that square? Well, we find out, verse 22. As they were making their hearts merry, right? They're having a few drinks. Behold, the men of the city, worthless fellows, surrounded the house, beating on the door. And they said to the old man, the master of the house, bring out the man who came into your house, that we may know him. And the man, the master of the house, went out to them and said to them, no, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Since this man has come into my house, do not do this vile thing. Behold, here are my virgin daughter and his concubine. Let me bring them out now, violate them, and do with them what seems good to you. But against this man, do not do this outrageous thing. But the men would not listen to him. So the man seized his concubine and made her go out to them. And they knew her and abused her all night until the morning. And as the dawn began to break, they let her go. And as morning appeared, the woman came and fell down at the door of the man's house where her master was until it was light. When it says they wanted to know him, this isn't like, what's your name? Where'd you come from? Right? Where are you going? Where are you headed? We'd like to get to know you. No, to know here in the text means sexual activity. The men of the city, these worthless fellows, wanted to literally rape this man. That's what they wanted to do. The owner goes outside and he says, this would be a vile thing because this man is my guest, which he has a duty, because he's in his house, to be hospitable and to give him protection. But then this guy just does something absolutely horrific. And I think many of us look at this and go, what did we just read? What just happened there? He offers them his own daughter and then the Levite's concubine. In seeking to protect the house guest, he offers two women up just simply so that they can be raped all night long. Why? Why does he not offer the Levite's manservant? After all, it is a man who's being demanded by this particular gang. Why? Because the Ephraimite, like the Levite and the concubine's father, see women as simple property. They are less valuable and more expendable than men. This was the view of women held by surrounding cultures. This was the view of the men of Israel, rather than the creation principle of God, that both man and woman were created both in God's image, both equally, intrinsically valuable before God. They didn't view it like this. See, this is a good spot for us just to pause for a minute and just simply ask, how does our own culture view women? Can our culture even define what a woman is? How horrific is that? How sad is that? How much like Judges are we? Are there ways in which we listen to our culture about how we should even view women, either in how we treat them or look at them or value them as sisters in Christ? There are veins in the church of like really hardcore complementarians. Maybe you've been in that vein, that you view women as simply lesser than men, devalued, not listened to. Now, what is the writer of Judges trying to portray? What he's really trying to get at here, in this moment in Judges, you see the Bible is very repetitive. I don't know if you've picked that up yet, getting us to Christ, right? It's very repetitive. This is Israel's Sodom moment, okay? We in the church can look at, Genesis 19, and we can talk about how bad the world was, how dark the world was, how amazing Israel was, but then we get to this chapter, and Israel's got a very dark spot in their history. They're just like Sodom. See, in Sodom, the strangers, they came to town. They were angels, and they came to rescue and save Lot. Men surrounded the house. They pounded on the door. They demanded to have sex with these angels. Lot, who is the host, begs the men of the city not to do this. He offers his own daughters instead. The only difference is that in Sodom, every man was a part of the mob. Here it's just some of the wicked men of the city. And in Sodom, the visitors were angels who simply struck the men of the city blind, in which it wasn't allowed to take place. But in Gibeah, with the Levite, he took his concubine. He sent her outside. They raped her all night long. This is a real story. I think sometimes we can look at maybe stories in the Bible and we can be kind of detached to that, but just imagine this moment happening in Bend. Imagine maybe some of the outcry. Imagine the news outlets, the social media outcry of what's taking place. The point is, this is how far Israel has fallen. They are just like Sodom. Sodom is the great Old Testament example of rebellion against God that rightly brings upon itself the judgment of God. The parallel between the pagan city and Israel carries just this super obvious message. Here are the people of God who have been given the covenants of God from Abraham to Moses. They have the law, they've got the prophets, they've got the tabernacle, they've had their Exodus story. They're not far removed from it. Throughout this book, they've been having Savior judges come through, yet despite all of this, all of God's kindness, all of God's revelation, all of God's care, they're no better than the Canaanites and pagan nations who received none of those blessings. God's people simply prove, as we do over and over, we're just not better. We're just not better. They become like Sodom. This depravity becomes legendary in Israel's history. See, the prophet Hosea, later on, nearly 3 centuries later, speaking of Israel's sin here in Gibeah, this moment, says, they have deeply corrupted themselves as in the days of Gibeah. He will remember their iniquity. He will punish their sins. Hosea chapter 9, verse 9. So while these men are drinking their IPAs or bubbly or whatever it is that they have going on, while these men are inside making themselves, the Bible says, merry, this concubine's being raped. While they go to bed, sleeping that night, she's being abused. And in the end, it was too much. She collapses and she dies there at the door. What happens? Verse 27. Her master rose up in the morning when he opened the doors of the house and went out to go on his way. Behold, there was his concubine laying at the door of the house with her hands on the threshold. And he said to her, "Get up, let us be going." But there was no answer. Then he put her on the donkey, and the man rose up and went away to his home. When he entered his house, he took a knife, Taking hold of his concubine, he divided her, limb by limb, into 12 pieces, and sent her throughout Israel, all the territory of Israel. And all who saw it said, such a thing has never happened or been seen from the day that the people of Israel came up out of the land of Egypt until this day. Consider it. Take counsel and speak. How callous. How hateful. How dark can one person be? Get up. She's at the door. Obviously bruised, bloodied, dead. Get up. It's almost like how someone would treat an animal. Get up. Let's get going. Come on. When there was no answer, picks her up, throws her on the donkey. He heads home. He then decides to go like creepy Dexter, takes a knife, cuts up his concubine limb by limb. Like, I can't fathom what's going on in this man's head. I told you, I think it was last week or the week before, man, I cut up an elk a little while ago. I cannot fathom sitting there with someone you are supposed to show an element of love towards and cut them up limb by limb and then send them to all of the tribes throughout Israel. It is hard to believe that this was this man's lover. Why does he do this? Because he wants vengeance on the men of Gibeah. Not for the treatment of the woman. After all, he sent her out there. But for the loss of his property. He's ticked. His property's gone. The author says, nothing like this. Not the men that wanted to rape. Nothing like this. The cutting up of the concubine has ever been done. So it's not just the actions of the gang rape, but the cutting up of the woman and then sending her around. The narrator is making quite clear that there is sin on all sides here. There is sin in every aspect of this. Now check this out. And I'm wrapping up and I'm going to tag out. Chapter 20 says, then all the people of Israel came out, from Dan to Beersheba, including the land of Gilead. The congregation assembled as one man to the Lord at Mizpah, and the chiefs of all the people of all the tribes of Israel presented themselves in the assembly of the people of God, 400,000 men on foot that drew the sword. Now the people of Benjamin heard that the people of Israel had gone up to Mizpah. The people of Israel said, tell us, how did this evil happen? And the Levite, the husband of the woman who was murdered, answered and said, I came to Gibeah that belongs to Benjamin, I and my concubine to spend the night. And the leaders of Gibeah rose against me, surrounded the house against me by night. They meant to kill me, and they violated my concubine, and she is dead. Israel assembles. They're actually united, but they're not united because of God, but because of the depravity of the sin of their own people. And now they are listening not to God, but the morally messed up Levite. Did you hear his account? It's filled with half-truths. Half-truths. He claims all the men of Gibeah, rather than the reality of some of the men of Gibeah were wicked men. He omits to mention that he gave up his concubine rather than fighting for her to protect her, reporting only that they raped her. No one hearing this account would suspect that he contributed to the death of this woman. No one would. Both Gibeah and the Levite are wrong. And this is what Paul addresses in the book of Romans, chapters 1 through 3, where he points out that when people don't know God, which is kind of what we've been dealing with in Judges, they are given over to all sorts of crazy, sinful desires. And it's not just the depravity out there, but the Levite, who should have been the moral religious person, as Romans chapter 2 says, is equally guilty. The religious moral dude and the mob are both equally guilty. And this is why Paul says in Romans chapter 3, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. The depraved gang rape people out there, those that violated the concubine out there, but also the Levite. No one in the story is righteous. No one in the world is. So how do we react? How should we react to the events recorded in Judges 19? We should mourn. We should mourn that. Not just for something that happened several thousand years ago. We should mourn that it happens today. We should weep with those who weep. We should also inspect our own hearts. See, what's going on in our hearts? Perhaps maybe you have burning sexual desires that either you have acted on or simply fantasized about, like the Gibeonites. Maybe that's your heart. Maybe like the Levite, we think, we would never do that, but we've enabled others to. Or we didn't prevent it. We don't fight for justice for those that might be weaker than ourselves, like the concubine. Instead, we tell a better story about who we are. There are sins of commission here, that's the rape, and there are sins of omission here. Omission, simply just standing by and allowing it to happen. This is the Canaanization of Israel. And whether we know it or not, all of us in some ways, unconsciously and even consciously, are shaped and enslaved by the values of our own culture rather than by the Lord. And if we're honest, we have to say, we can relate to both these guys in many ways. We're just as wicked. And left to ourselves, could probably equally do some horrific things depending on the scenario that we were involved in. That's a problem. But the story moves on. Brad, tapping out, what happens next?
Hello? There we go. A few weeks ago, as we started this, Lauren warned us. He said, this is a pretty jacked up book. And I don't know that we completely fathomed how jacked up it was at that time. And so this morning's pretty sobering. As we've been journeying through the book of Judges, we're seeing the brutal consequences of a nation, of communities, of individuals. What they've experienced is they've truly walked away from God. And the book of Judges is now going to conclude in chapter 20 and 21 with unspeakable pictures of brutality, of bloodshed, and of division. Let's just ask this question. Ever been offended by somebody else before? Ever been wounded by somebody else before? What if it was a group of people, maybe more powerful than you, maybe with a louder voice? How did that feel? How'd that make, what did you want after that? You've been put in your place by a larger, stronger group. How did that feel? What did you want? Maybe you wanted some empathy, somebody to care for you. Maybe you wanted some reinforcements. Maybe you wanted your pound of flesh, right? And in this context, this Levite in his desperation does the unspeakable to gain some support and some reinforcements. The unspeakable. What's this Levite want? He wants justice. How's he going to get it? And by the way, he's not going to get it by going to God. He's not going to God and saying, hey, God, would you bring justice? God, would you do this? Would you bring your power? God, would you defend me? Instead, what's he doing? He's going to man, all right? He's going to the nation of Israel. He wants man's defense and man's justice. He sends out a strong, illustrated message to Israel. He's physically sending body parts of his concubine to Israel, and he's saying, I want you to physically look at this woman, and then I want you to physically show up and defend me. Come to my aid. Help me out. Now, time out. We know in life, at times, we will be offended. In life, at times, we will be hurt. In life, there's a natural tendency to just try to defend ourselves, to make ourselves look better. How? By making other people look worse. Lauren just talked about it. Dude's not telling the whole story. He's trying to make himself look better by making the Gibeonites look worse. And sometimes these false narratives set off a firestorm that costs lives and tears apart society. By the way, it's so easy to see the sin in other people's life and at the same time to self-righteously edit our own story to make ourselves look better. Particularly, by the way, when we want some blood, we want our pound of flesh. We've been hurt and wounded deeply. So the tribes of Israel, they physically see what's going on. They see the sin of their brother Benjamin. So the question is, how will they respond? We'll pick it up in verse 8. Verse 8 says, "And all the people arose as one man, saying, None of us will go to his tent, none of us will return to his house. But now this is what we will do to Gibeah. We will go up against it by lot. We will take 10 men of 100 throughout all the tribes of Israel, and 100 of 1,000, and 1,000 of 10,000 to bring provision for the people. But when they came, that when they come, they may repay Gibeah of Benjamin for all the outrage they have committed in Israel." So all the men of Israel gathered against the city, united as one man. And all the tribes of Israel sent men throughout all the tribes of Benjamin, saying, "What evil is this that has taken place among you? Now, therefore, give up the men, the worthless fellows in Gibeah, that we may put them to death and purge evil from Israel." But the Benjaminites would not listen to the voice of their brothers, the people of Israel. Israel demands justice. And so let's just look at the posture of Israel right now. What's their posture? Well, verse 1 says they assembled as one man. Verse 8, the people arose as one man. Verse 11, all the men of Israel gathered against the city, united as one man. All right, so what's their posture and what's their position? They're unified right now. The cause they are unified against, in verse 11, it says they're unified against purging evil. They want to repay Gibeah for what they've done. What do they want? They want justice. When do they want it? They want it now. Now, let me give you some context, okay? This is united as they have been since chapter 1 of this book. And here's the problem, that we're seeing the fallout of the depravity of man as what? They've just been doing what's right in their own eyes. Here's the fallout. They are now united against their own brothers. This is the sad irony of just how far Israel has fallen. Evil is connected now to themselves. Listen, if they would have been this united when they went into the promised land and just obeying God and ridding them of the Canaanites lust-filled ways wouldn't have become a part of Israel's lifestyle at this point. Israel, here's the sad point, they're finally recognizing sin, but they're recognizing the sin in their own lives rather than the nations around them that was seducing them. And so Israel chooses blood as an answer to their problem. They wage war now against their own brothers, the Benjaminites. And so let me just give you a summary now for the sake of time of verses 15 through 25. Benjamin's tough. Okay, they're going to go up against Benjamin in war. Benjamin's tough. They had a special forces unit of left-handed slingshot assassins. Okay? Israel goes to battle with 400,000 troops. Benjamin has 26,000. Okay? 400,000 against 26,000. Day one, they wage war. Benjamin takes no casualties. No casualties over here. And Israel loses 22,000 people. The next day, the war continues. Again, Benjamin takes no casualties, and they kill 18,000 Israelites. And now we pick it up after the second battle in verse 26. Verse 26, then all the people of Israel, the whole army, went up and came to Bethel and wept. And they sat before the Lord and fasted that day until evening and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. And the people of Israel inquired of the Lord, for the ark of the covenant of God was there in those days. And Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, ministered before it in those days, saying, shall we go out once more into battle against our brothers and the people of Benjamin, or shall we cease? And the Lord said, go up, for tomorrow I will give them into your hand. What's going on in these verses? God's beginning to judge Israel at this point. Now, let me just pause and once again put things in context. We're going to get a picture of just how far Israel has fallen as well as their current condition. Go back to chapter 1, verse 1. Chapter 1, verse 1, it says, after the death of Joshua, the people of Israel inquired of the Lord, who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? So this is a picture back at the beginning of Judges of a nation that is dependent upon God, that is seeking God, that's asking for wisdom, that's asking for direction, right? And ultimately, by extension, obedience to where God is leading them. Is that where we're at now? That's not where we're at now. Israel exchanged God's mission for their mission, God's instructions for their own reactive response, God's voice for their voice. No longer are they fighting the Canaanites, they're fighting against themselves. They're destroying themselves. And why are they destroying themselves? It's because they've just simply become like the other nations. They've abandoned God. And by the way, this is always the path: self-destruction, fighting themselves. Notice this, before they go to war, and I just summarized it, go back and read the text, they never even came up to God and say, hey, God, would you give us direction? Should we go into war? Should we fight against our brothers? No, they just show up and they say, hey, God, we're going to go fight against Benjamin, all right? So our question is, what tribe should go up first, right? Let's just pause. Isn't that just like us sometimes? Like we come up with our own plans. We've got our own dreams. We've got our own desires. We rely upon our own wisdom, our own knowledge. And then sometimes we throw up an obligatory prayer and say, God, hey, heading out, God, all right? Would you bless me, God? And then what happens when plans don't come to fruition the way we thought they should? Like we get angry. We get frustrated. We get depressed. We begin blaming God. Day one, Israel says, hey, we're going out, God. Who should go up first? By the way, even in this context, within the text, God answers, says, send up Judah. Israel's destroyed. The next day, they come back and they say, God, should we go up and fight? God still answers at this time. God says, yep, go ahead and go fight. Again, Israel's destroyed. Day three, God, should we go up or should we just call it good at this point? And God said, I'm going to put an end to this madness, okay? Tomorrow, I'm going to give you into their hand. What is going on here? What's happening? The Lord is judging the gross sin of Benjamin, but also he is judging the self-righteousness and the pride of Israel. Both sides are being judged. They're both doing what's right in their own eyes. Look at both sides. There's not going to be a winner on either side of this. Sadness and pain is woven out throughout this narrative as brother takes up arms against brother. And how does the situation resolve? Okay, 3 days of war. How's the situation resolve? Again, just summarizing this. Israel, they lay out an ambush for Benjamin. And the text wraps up by saying, and the men of Israel turned back against the people of Benjamin and struck them with the edge of the sword, the city, men and beasts, and all they found. And all the towns that they found, they set on fire. Let's be clear now. The resolution to this conflict was not justice. The resolution to this conflict was not an eye for an eye. The resolution to this conflict was actually this. It's genocide. A society dies for the sins of few. And by the way, what we're beginning to see now is the effects of bitterness. The effects that bitterness has when it comes to the actions of the offended. Here's the thing. Pay close attention to this. Listen. Bitterness cloaks itself under the noble cause of justice, but it never stops there. It's going to cloak itself. It's going to say, hey, this is going to look a lot like justice, but listen, it ain't going to stop there. I'll just tell you the truth. Like, some of you may struggle with bitterness. There's a situation in my recent history, I'll just be honest with you. I'll take the mask off and tell the truth, where I'm struggling with some bitterness with a certain individual. I shared with you this past summer that my really very cool neighbor, his house caught on fire, which caught my house on fire. And after that fire, I had a conversation with his insurance adjuster. Now, in the fire, not only did our house catch on fire, but it melted my wife's car, and it was a total loss. So I'm having a conversation with his adjuster, and his adjuster starts laughing and mocking me in front of the whole neighborhood. I mean, it's a huge fire. The whole neighborhood's out there. And he's saying, I love melted cars. Those are pretty funny. And he's just downplaying like everything that's happened to my house and mocking me in front of the neighborhood. How's that feel, right? By the way, to this day, he's still leading the charge. He's still withholding, like I haven't even been financially given restitution for anything from that insurance. And he's leading the charge on that. I'm a little bitter. I'm working through that. I'm trying to see him through the eyes of God right now, right? God, I want your vengeance. And listen, smite him, almighty smiter, right? You listen, I can be noble. I'll tell you the truth. I can be noble and I can say, listen, I just want a check and I want an apology, right? But I'll tell you, I've thought this and I've actually voiced it. I might have even voiced it to you, Lauren. Like, listen, if dude thinks melted cars are so funny, I'm going to go over there. I'm going to melt all the cars on his property, right? But listen, is that justice? Is that an eye for an eye? You know what that is? That's vengeful bitterness. And bitterness ultimately doesn't care about justice. Listen, that's why the author of Hebrews warns us not to let the root of bitterness grow in our lives, because it just takes the law into its own hands. It has no interest in justice. It consumes and defiles the person that it's growing in. Back to the text. What's the Civil War teach us? The progression of sin always ends in self-destruction. And even within their self-destruction, listen, God is still speaking, okay? Verse 18, Judah says, they say, God, what should we do? Who should go up first? God answers, Judah should go first. God answers them, go up against them, verse 23. Verse 23 later on, go up for tomorrow, I'll give you into their hand. Actually, verse 28, go up tomorrow, I'll give you into their hand. And then after the war's all over, what's the text tell us? And the Lord defeated Benjamin before Israel. And this is the only time in this entire narrative that the Lord speaks. God is giving directions in the midst of civil war. God knows the results of what's going to happen. There needs to be a purging within Israel. They've rejected the Lord. They've rejected their king. And they are paying a price for it right now. He is turning them over to the penalty of their sin. And death is reigning throughout Israel. Here's how far they have fallen. To purge evil in Israel, all Israel needs to be purged. On one side, you got the tribe of Benjamin. It teaches us about the self-deception of sin. Like, rather than punish sin, they just excuse it. Like, rather than being called out on it, they defend it. They even go to war over it. And on the other side, you have Israel, and it teaches us about the self-righteousness of sin. By the way, sin is so easy to spot in other people, right? But we justify it all the time. Let's just tell the truth. We look at other people and say, man, your sin is deplorable. Oh, but my sin, it's what? It's justifiable. You catch that? We defend our own sin. And as the smoke clears on the Civil War, we're left with the last chapter. And for the sake of time, let me just summarize it. The last chapter starts off with a little bit of a flashback. The nation of Israel, they'd got together, and they're talking about Benjamin. They said, hey, here's what we're going to do. We're never going to give any of our daughters to them again as wives, all right? Well, now they're looking at Benjamin, right? And after the war, they're thinking, okay, they're going to go extinct, right? They got to have some wives here. So they're getting together, and they're like, we made an oath. We're not going to give any of everybody that was at that meeting. We all promised that we're not going to give any wives to Benjamin. What are we going to do? Israel is going to be without one of the tribes. And they start thinking, they're like, was there anybody that didn't show up and take that oath? And sure enough, Jabesh Gilead didn't show up. So what's their solution? They go out and they kill every man, woman, and child in Jabesh Gilead. And they save the virgins, the young ladies. And they go and give these young ladies to Benjamin for wives. And then from there, there's not enough wives, and so the story wraps up with them going to Shiloh. And it's a creepy story of all these dudes hiding in the bushes, waiting for the young daughters to come out to the vineyards dancing, and they just kidnap these daughters and take them off to be their wives. Here's what we see. The road to hell is paved with wicked men offering a solution to sin. At this point, Israel is their own worst enemy. It's the result, here it is, we've seen this the whole way through, it's the result of doing things right in their own eyes. They make a rash vow, nobody's given any daughters to Benjamin, and now they're stuck. They blame God for the situation they're in. By the way, I'm sure you've never done that before, right? Ever blamed God? I told Lauren this last week, I said, listen, my flesh doesn't need any help jacking me up. It does an amazing job on its own. But here's the problem. My flesh never takes responsibility for its actions. My flesh is always blaming other people and blaming God. Israel's now faced with the extinction of one of their tribes, so they come up with a solution. It looks like a lot like a dog returning to its vomit. They don't learn from one foolish oath, so they make another one. Like they're upset at Benjamin, right? Because what? Because there was murder and rape, and their solution to the problem is what? More murder and rape? Do you see the hypocrisy here? They're doing this, why? Because it seems right in their own eyes, because they felt like it. So they kill man, woman, and child from Jabesh Gilead, only to save the virgins, so Benjamin doesn't go extinct. Here's what's going on. Judges wraps up. Man, heartbreaking and sad. It's a pagan culture. And it's a direct result of doing what's right in your own eyes. And the more that these people try to fix things by doing what's right in their own eyes, the bigger mess they make. By the way, listen, come on, let's just tell the truth. Here it is. You live in a pagan culture, but we are not called to be pagan. Does that make sense? We are called to be God's people. Israel's problem was a rejection of the Lord as their king. They became like the nations around them, and they destroyed themselves in the process. But even in the midst of it, God kept his promise, and he kept a remnant. The king we're seeing in Judges was rejected, but we're going to find out as we continue on, the king still has a plan. So as we wrap up, I think it just calls us to ask two questions of ourselves as we land the plane. Number one, who's your king? Who's your king? And I'm not talking about a king just in title alone. I'm not talking about an intellectual king. I'm talking about an active king in your life, one who's leading you through life. So is someone leading you through life, or are you leading yourself through life? Who is your authority? Because you will always obey and listen and follow the authority. Do you have a king that's your authority, or are you your own authority? We have to ask that question this morning. And the second question is this: how's your eyesight? How's your eyesight? Israel was doing what was right in their own eyes, and look what it got them. Theologically, we need to come to the understanding that apart from the working of God the Spirit in our lives, we are all blind. We're the blind leading the blind, hoping and guessing. But the gospel says this: there's one who's gone before us, right? Who's not a source of truth, but is the embodiment of truth, truth itself, to lead us and to guide us. So let's do this. Let's transition, and we want to do just a little bit, a few moments of just kind of open mic. Maybe there's something that through the course of Judges, like God's been speaking to you or revealing to you. We'll just take a couple people. Lauren's going to come up now. He's just going to kind of MC this. I'm going to walk around with the mic. If you have something you want to share, just a short little phrase. Hey, this is one thing. Maybe it's a reminder. I've been reminded of this. Been reminded of God's faithfulness. I've been reminded of the gospel in this, whatever that may be. Just a few short thoughts, and we'll take two or three people, and then Lauren's going to tie a big bow on our series through Judges. So raise your hand. You have something to share. Who's got something to share? I know this is new.
Nobody learned anything in Judges.
Yeah, exactly. I think we're all shell-shocked from today. Yeah. Who's got something? Come on. I know you got something. Excellent. I'll come here in the back.
Say your name so we know who you are.
Yeah. Introduce yourself.
Jude. Just going through Judges, you look at our times right now. and how both sides have their issues. And, one side is like giving their things that they do, and they're saying, oh, it's okay, I'll just give a little. I'll just take a smidge. I'll just take a peek. And they give just a little bit each time, and then what happens is it just dilutes the water. And I think overall, as Christians, and we don't value our relationships, we don't value each other, we diluted the water so much to this point that, the Bible is what we should be following, and not just going, oh, these things they'll be okay. Everybody else is doing it. And so through all of Judges that I've noticed that's kind of what was occurring all to this point.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Debbie, and I'm just been reminded through Judges how kind God is, and in the beginning how he sent his prophets to try to help the people. And I like seeing that part of God and how he is always with us.
That's good. Thanks.
My name's Colleen. I was thinking about not only the church, but also what's going on in our country right now, and how the answer is really God, not the Republican Party, not the Democrat Party, not even who becomes president. We need God and Jesus to be our king, and that's really the answer. And the United States is largely patterned after Israel, and so it's really sobering to me to pray for my country more. Pray for revival.
Maybe one more. Maybe one more. Oh, yes.
I'm Brooklyn, and I learned that Israel is it repeats a lot, and God still listens, and he's still watching, and it kind of relates to life right now. People repeat mistakes sometimes, but God still forgives, and he still watches.
Shoot, just put the bow on it right there. Yeah. Judges ends with that phrase. We've looked at it over and over. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Doing what's right in our own eyes looks like hell. That's what it looks like. And compounded sin just brings brokenness and pain. And Judges leaves us just hanging with this idea, we really do need a king that's going to rescue us, rule us, a king that's going to change us. And the book of Judges, what I love about this is it doesn't exist by itself. Because you can look at this and go, what the heck? What is happening? Is God even working? You get these last 4 chapters and you don't feel like God is moving and God is working, but there is another book, and it's the book we're going to cover next week, or start to cover, the book of Ruth. What you need to understand is Ruth is happening at the exact same time. And do you know what God is doing? He's going to take a Moabite woman, not an Israelite. He's going to save this woman, bring her into a family that is an Israelite family. Her husband dies. It starts off with just pain, more tragedy. But then God uses this woman to meet a man who will be a redeemer. And we're going to learn about this idea of a kinsman redeemer, somebody close that can come in and redeem this woman. And do you know how the end of Ruth ends? It tells us this little secret. It says, and the woman of the neighborhood gave him a name, Ruth's son, saying, a son has been born to Naomi, because she's mother-in-law. They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of King David. So while we look in Judges and it's saying, we need a king, we need a king, we need a king, what's actually happening is God is working in the midst of them to bring about a redeemer who would be the king that Israel wanted in King David, but who points us to who? The even better King, Jesus Christ, who will come from the lineage of David. So that's what we have to look forward to. And we desperately need that king, because as Brooklyn told us, we're all messed up. And yet God continues to forgive us, and the only way he can do that is because of what he's done for us in his Son. So let's pray. God, we thank you so much for being that king that we have talked about over and over throughout this book, the king that we know that we need desperately. We need you as king. And so we thank you, Jesus, not as just the king for today, but we need you to be the king that comes. And so we look forward to your return, where you set up your forever kingdom. And so, Jesus, we look forward to you returning. We look forward to what you're doing in the midst of us, in our hearts, in this church. We know that maybe when things do look dark in culture or around us, that even just like this story of Ruth that we're going to be able to see, you're still at work. You're still redeeming. You're still doing things. And we trust you in that. In Jesus' name, amen. This time we're going to just close up here this morning with these last couple songs. Feel free to come to the table, dine, partake in the body and the blood of Christ. That is God's gift of grace to you. That is your reminder here today that you have been completely and totally loved and you are forgiven. So we invite you as followers of Christ to come and partake in what God has done for us. If you desire to give, there are boxes at the table there. We're just going to sing these last few songs and then we'll head out.